Well, I'm very excited to welcome both our in-house and live stream audience tonight. I think there's our usual crowd of about 50 people online, and I hope you'll share in the chat where you're tuning in from. I know we have folks from the West Coast and all across this great land of ours. This is the grand finale of the 2022-2023 Read the Revolution speaker series. And as we have done for at least the past year, if not the last 2 years, we have some featured artifacts which tries to encourage people to actually come to the museum physically. You get to actually see some cool things in person. Two things tonight. First of all, an actual original stamp from the Stamp Act. Most of them were burned, right, Mary Beth? But a few of them, including this embossed version that says America across the top that would have been affixed to a legal document, is on display. And then also this amazing teapot that was excavated on the site of the museum during our construction. Was from a privy from a family, Benjamin and Mary Humphreys, who kept kind of a speakeasy of sort, an illegal tavern on a little side alley that's basically right about where the center of the museum is today. It was identified initially as maybe a Liverpool, just not a terribly exciting example of a 1760s English teapot, but on a hunch, the ceramics scholar Rob Hunter from Colonial Williamsburg asked if he could borrow it for a little bit of testing. And it turns out that the clay, the body of this teapot, comes from Cherokee country. It is a type of clay called unikur in the Cherokee language, the Scali language, that was actually brought up to Philadelphia as they were experimenting with how to make hard paste porcelain. And so it is a lead-glazed, hard paste porcelain, American-made teapot, responding to the non-importation and American manufacturers movements of the 1760s, early 1770s. So it's really rare, like there is literally only one. In 1767, actually a Scottish merchant in this neighborhood advertised what he called Pennsylvania penciled teapots, penciled in the sense of having the blue decoration on it there. So for those of you who are tuning in, don't you wish you had come here to the museum to see this in person? So it's a great reminder to thank all of the members, first of all, of our Revolution Society and our Collections Society here at the museum. These are members who are devoted to supporting the museum through their annual contributions. Our Collections Society are those of us, it's kind of like an expansion pack on your membership if you're really into hanging out with curators, getting first glimpses of new acquisitions at the museum. And we do great tours every year. We go out for an off-site private collection visit. So we're doing all that planning right now, and it's a great time to inquire. You can always contact members of our development staff, Julia Newman, and the others, if you're interested in finding out a little bit more about the wonderful fellowship of the Collections Society. Now, very excited to announce the kickoff for our fall lecture series, which will take place on Thursday, September 21st. Our annual Carl M. Buckles Memorial Lecture will this year be delivered by Yale law professor Akil Reed Amar, and he'll be speaking about his book, The Words That Made Us, America's Constitutional Conversation, 1760 to 1840. And we'd like to thank a number of donors who have already stepped up to support that lecture, which is an important fundraising opportunity for the museum, as well as a great, wonderful exploration of constitutional thought, political thought of the revolutionary era. So hopefully that list will be growing, and all of you could see your names up there on September 21st. Next, on June 16th, you're all invited to a screening of a special 30-minute documentary about the museum's Black Founders exhibit, the Fortin family of Philadelphia. We've partnered with WHYY, which is Philadelphia's public television station, to produce this documentary, really tracing the making and the content of this really groundbreaking exhibition that's running at the museum through November 26th. So if you visit the museum and click in, and you can find out about getting tickets to be here for that, that wonderful evening event. That'll be downstairs in the Lenfest Meyer Theater. Next slide's going to introduce us to the main event of the evening. So we're going to introduce, of course, our Mary Beth Norton, who is a giant in the field of writing about the American Revolution, the early Republic, women's history, but my words could not possibly match those of the surprise guests that we have brought here this evening to welcome you to the stage. So would my good friend Eric, where's Eric Blair? Joanna, you were supposed to be up front so I could just tee you right up here. And share your heartwarming story, Eric, and your connection to Professor.
Oh no!
Hi, Mary Beth. So this is not an introduction, because Mary Beth Norton needs no such thing. I love reminiscing about Dr. Norton as my thesis seminar advisor at Cornell, where our cohort giddily watched her star in the celebrity genealogy TV show, Who Do You Think You Are? Here she helped Sarah Jessica Parker of Sex and the City and Hocus Pocus fame discover that Ms. Parker was actually descended from an accused witch who was living in Salem during the time in which was set the iconic 1993 film. When explaining to the audience this information that had just altered her entire identity, I'll never forget the famous actress exclaiming excitedly, "Well," and Mary Beth said. Yet what wouldn't come through national television, the pages of 1774, the long year of the Revolution, which won the 2021 George Washington Prize, or Liberty's Daughters, the revolutionary experience of American women, 1750 to 1800, or indeed what won't be obvious in Dr. Norton's conversation during this evening's installment of Read the Revolution, is what an extraordinary teacher and shaper of young lives she is and has been as a professor at Cornell for over 50 years. Mary Beth Norton taught me how to communicate with the written word and would have been very displeased by one of the above run-on sentences had it been written down. She taught me how to properly ask questions, how to think in order to get closer to the truth. Learning how to communicate in an academic setting was paramount to my ability to communicate in many professional environments today, and understanding how to get closer to the elusive truth has been essential in navigating the chaos of our oversubscribed world. I would like to think Mary Beth minted me an eternal student of history, probably like many of you here today. It's because of her that I'm a member of the Museum's Revolution Society and Collection Society, which I'm happy to talk more about after the program, obviously, and an enthusiastic supporter of our magnificent mission. My brand of boosterism could only have been developed and shaped by a once-in-a-lifetime professor like Mary Beth Norton. Mary Beth may have taught me some history, to be sure, but she taught me history, the discipline, which means so very much to me, and always will. As she discusses some men's and women's involvements in pre-revolutionary politics in today's context this evening, know that her own impact on history and America's story has been tremendous across generations of her many students, men and women, living in our country in 2023. Thank you.
The last time I saw him was in Ithaca, so I'm very surprised to see Eric here tonight. Let me just get this set up. So I want to begin this evening by quoting myself from the preface to Liberty's Daughters, which was originally published in 1980, 43 years ago. I researched and wrote that book in the 1970s, when we knew a lot less about the lives of early American men and women than we know now. And we know a lot more thanks to many historians other than myself, including some that are here tonight. Since I started my research in the middle of the 18th century for that book, I realized that I could say nothing with confidence about women before then. And so I wrote in the preface, and here's my quote. Quote, "The lives of colonial women in the 17th century might have been similar to or different from those I describe in the mid-18th century. I do not know which, nor do I intend to speculate about a subject on which there is at present such inadequate information. I then, having said I didn't know anything about before 1750, I then decided to learn about what I didn't know and to investigate the lives of male and female colonists in the early 17th century. As I reported in my book, Founding Mothers and Fathers, which was published in 1996, realize that was 16 years after Liberty's Daughters. I was doing other things too. I discovered that many women's experiences were indeed very different from those that I had detailed in Liberty's Daughters. So it was really good that I said I didn't know anything about it before 1750. In particular, I realized that women of wealthy, sometimes aristocratic backgrounds took leading political and religious roles in the early colonies and rarely faced challenges when they did so. Their status, inherited from their natal families or obtained through prominent husbands, led them to be accepted as leaders in a society in which status trumped gender. I want to repeat that. Status trumped gender in the 17th century. It was more important that you were a high-status person than that you were a man or a woman in 17th century America and England if you did have high status. That helped to explain the impact on the early settlements of such now famous women as Anne Hutchinson of Massachusetts Bay, Margaret Brent in Maryland, and Lady Frances Berkeley in Virginia, all of whom I've now subsequently written about. The finding that high-status women, that for high-status women, their standing was more significant than their gender in determining their social position confronted me with an important question, one that in part prompted the reassessment that I'm undertaking tonight. In Liberty's Daughters, I had identified a pattern in which gender trumped status, particularly with respect to politics. An early explicit statement came from Esther Edwards Burr, the wife of the Reverend Jonathan Burr, the wife of Jonathan Burr, the daughter of Jonathan Edwards, the mother of Aaron Burr, the sort of prominent woman who in the previous century would have readily engaged in political activity and who would not have been criticized for doing so. But in 1755, Esther Burr observed to a friend, quote, "The men say that women have no business to concern themselves with politics." And so she didn't concern herself with politics. And not just men said that. In the 1760s and early 1770s, and even during the war, the women whose letters and diaries I read for Liberty's Daughters commonly expressed reluctance to, as they said, abandon their sphere in order to enter the political realm, which they understood as belonging exclusively to men. In Liberty's Daughters, I documented numerous comments along those lines from many women and men. Here's just one example. A Virginia woman, after offering what I regarded as a very astute political analysis of the situation in 1776, said, quote, "Don't think I'm engaging in politics. No, I assure you it's a subject for which I have not either talents or inclination to enter upon," end quote. Now, the contrast presented me with an obvious question. When did societal attitudes change? Why and how did it become inappropriate for educated and prominent women who were basically those whose correspondence had survived and which I had read, because they were educated and prominent, and that's why their correspondence survived and was given to libraries where I was able to read it. When did they become convinced that involvement in political discussions, let alone political activity, was not suitable for them? I speculated in Founding Mothers and Fathers that the answer lay in developments in America late in the 17th century. But when I investigated that surmise in depth, I discovered I was wrong. This is what historians do. As Eric knows, when you ask questions, you often find that your tentative answers are wrong. So I realized instead that the answer lay in England, and specifically in the early 18th century, during and after the reign of Queen Anne, who we don't think about very much. Separated by Their Sex, which I published in 2011, explicated my response to the central conundrum about politics posed by the contrast evident in the other two books. Women's sphere, in the British formulation, emphatically, and I mean emphatically, excluded politics. Crucially important in cementing that definition, though not in creating it, were the writings of Richard Steele and Joseph Addison in The Spectator and other publications. And of course, I don't probably need to tell or remind a Philadelphia audience that when Benjamin Franklin was teaching himself how to write, what he did was to rewrite and rewrite and rewrite the essays of The Spectator. So it was something that was really done repeatedly, not just by him, but for others. So what I want to do is, again, quote myself, and this is part of a key paragraph from my book. In The Spectator, Addison introduced a lengthy discussion by alluding to a passage in the Iliad. Homer, he noted, had told his wife to mind her spinning after she attempted to comment on an upcoming battle. Note the spinning reference, we'll come back to that. Addison explained that thereby Homer insisted, quote, that men and women ought to busy themselves in their proper spheres and on such matters as are suitable to their respective sex. He warned women to avoid what he called party rage. Excessive partisanship, a vice even for men, was altogether, he said, repugnant to the softness, modesty, and those other endearing qualities which are natural to the fair sex. Addison even contended at length that, quote, there is nothing so bad for the face as party zeal. Observing that he never knew a female partisan who retained her beauty for more than a year, he advised his female readers to avoid all political disputes, quote, as they value their complexions. So when I read this, I had the sense that what you get is the idea of women who are beautiful for 365 days, and then on the 366th day, they lose all their beauty because they've become partisans, and partisan has destroyed their beauty. So that's the background of my remarks this evening, for I now know what I didn't know when I first read the account of what roles women played in the resistance to Great Britain in the 1760s and 1770s. Educated Anglo-American women, products of 18th century British cultural imperatives, knew that their proper place did not include political involvement, even to the extent of commenting on the subject. And yet, as they reported in their letters and diaries, by the mid-1760s, political issues surrounded all of them. For example, in fall 1765, the 22-year-old Sally Franklin told her father, Benjamin, who was then resident in London, with respect to the Stamp Act, which we've got evidence of right here, quote, that nothing else is talked of, everybody has something to say, end quote. So that's the background. That's what I learned when I did further research, and then I've done some more since then. And, excuse me, because of, I wanted to say that a lot of the research I'll be talking about tonight, which is new research that I have done, is because of the availability of digitized newspapers and my ability to do keyword searches on colonial newspapers. And so I could do a much more precise examination of what women were doing and what they were doing and what was reported in the newspapers in the 1760s and 1770s, much more than I was ever able to do before. I actually had some long ago students who read newspapers for me occasionally, but it was nothing like what I could do thanks to the computer and thanks to America's historical newspapers online. So what you're going to hear tonight is the results of my recent research on the same themes that I did back in the 70s, but with very different tools available to me. So in a context in which long-standing cultural practice clashed with current events, it is hardly surprising that when opposition to the 1765 Stamp Act began in the American colonies, men took the lead and women participated seldom and peripherally. Let me just remind you of the contents of the Stamp Act. It required tax stamps on all official documents and publications, copying a law that had been in place in England for decades. And it more directly affected merchants, lawyers, and printers than other colonists, but all would have to pay, as you'll find out in a minute. Before the act was to effect on November 1st, Americans protested the act in several different ways. Direct crowd action in which effigies of British officials were hanged, paraded around towns, then publicly burned, a Stamp Act Congress that dispatched protest resolutions to Parliament, and a non-importation agreement among merchants intended to pressure their British counterparts, in turn to pressure Parliament to repeal the law. In all such actions, women's only possible role was to be onlookers. So, for instance, a much reprinted account of the hanging in effigy in Maryland of the symbolic funeral of the provincial stamp distributor in late November of 1765 accordingly described the, quote, female spectators as laughing loudly at the event, and followed by a supper and a ball in which the ladies, quote, made a brilliant appearance. And we'll get very familiar with that phrase. But non-importation potentially required American colonists to replace items previously imported from Great Britain, most notably textiles. And therefore, some newspaper articles began to mention the need for increasing home manufactures of woolen and linen clothing, since cotton was rarely used at this time. Women with spinning wheels and looms could at least theoretically supply colonial needs by producing homespun. So the Providence Gazette in August 1765 commented, quote, "The ladies to their honor, be it spoken, now esteem it no disgrace to turn to the spinning wheel and contribute to the prosperity of their country." Note that phrase, consider it no disgrace. So what does that mean? It means that these are well-to-do women who are turning to spinning wheels for patriotic reasons, spinning being normally done by enslaved women and servants. So in other words, they're reducing their social status in a way by what they're doing for political reasons or for patriotic reasons. Yet, I will point out to all of you that the ladies of Maryland, with their, quote, brilliant appearance a few months later, were presumably not dressed in homespun for all of the praise of homespun. Now, the sole newspaper accounts that initially spoke of direct action by women against the Stamp Act had to do with marriage. This may be a surprise. Among the documents requiring tax stamps after November 1st were marriage licenses. And so one New York newspaper in December claimed that, quote, several genteel couples had married without licenses and that many young women had declared that they would only marry in the same way. I particularly like the report that I found in the Newport, Rhode Island newspaper of a woman described as, quote, in the bloom of youth, with virtue and accomplishments sufficient to excite the most pleasing expectations of happiness in the marriage state, who had proclaimed that she would rather be an old maid than comply with the act. So I love the fact that they described at great detail how virtuous and gorgeous and well accomplished she was and so forth, but she's decided she's not going to comply with the act regardless. Now, because the production of homespun had acquired patriotic meaning, the early months of 1766 brought the first newspaper accounts of, quote, young ladies gathering for spinning bees or matches at the homes of prominent New England citizens. Newspaper reports of such events, which in Liberty's Daughters I termed ideological showcases, made their purposes explicit. The earliest one I have now located, much sooner than I had ever found before in the 1970s, was held in Providence in early March of 1766. And was proclaimed by the Newport Mercury to be, quote, a laudable example for all ladies in Newport and elsewhere who propose to promote industry and retrieve from ruin their sinking country. Another account of the same gathering in the Providence Gazette revealed that the participants agreed to forego the use of tea, of course, another import from Britain, that they, quote, unanimously resolved that the Stamp Act was unconstitutional, and that they would buy no British manufactured goods until it was repealed, and in addition, that they, like others, of course, would not marry any men who obeyed the law. The newspaper accounts dubbed both that event and a second 2 months later in Norwich, Connecticut, on May 1st, to be meetings of Daughters of Liberty, the first times of many that phrase was employed in print, and of course it gave me my title for my book. Such terminology might seem to have signaled the movement of women openly into the public realm, if for no other reason that it would seem to parallel phrasing to the name Sons of Liberty, the men's organization that had a major role in organizing public Stamp Act protests. Yet that was not the case. Any trend was halted because news of the Act's repeal arrived later in May 1766. Remember, these first reports came in March and April, and so the Act was repealed in May 1766 and was widely celebrated publicly. Published accounts of those celebrations placed women solely into decorative roles. Again, we get the brilliant appearance. For example, a frequently reprinted report from Philadelphia revealed that ladies exercised their fancies in placing, quote, lights, devices, etc., for a city illumination. I'd love to know what the devices were for a city illumination in Philadelphia, but in any event, that this is what the ladies did, and that in other towns and cities, their brilliant appearance was again praised at balls or merely as they passed in the streets. In New York, it was said the ladies made a brilliant appearance as they walked around the streets during the celebrations of the repeal of the Stamp Act. But maybe best of all was what Philadelphia men did in marking the retrenchment. They formally resolved now they will clothe themselves in new suits from Britain, and they will give all that homespun to the poor. So much for the homespun that women had carefully been supposedly making. Who knows? I want to consider briefly these first manifestations of Anglo-American women's organized political activity. Initially, what should strike us is that such actions began with the most obviously feminine ways possible. That is, through marriage, or rather refusing marriage and spinning. Marriage was essentially universal for women in the period, so rejecting or delaying it for political reasons definitely made a statement. And as I observed in Liberty's Daughters, spinning symbolized femininity in a way that few other occupations did. Work at the wheels, either flax or wool wheels, normally consumed the attention of ordinary young women in rural areas and sometimes even in urban environments. Their mothers, fully occupied with younger children, would hardly have had time to devote to a task that, even if it didn't lead to the weaving and making of homespun clothing, usefully created yarn that could be knitted into stockings or linen thread that could make handkerchiefs or other small items. Two elements of the reported gatherings were unusual. First, the collective and public nature of the activity. For spinning was normally a solitary chore done in one's home. And second, the spinners were consistently described as ladies of superior status. And so it was important that, as I had pointed out before, that it was no disgrace, quote unquote, for women to start using the spinning wheels. In short, well-off young women were demonstrating their patriotism by engaging publicly in an activity that previously would have been regarded as the work of servants, the enslaved, or other lower-class women. I'm going to have some more to say about these spinning meetings later, but one point needs to be highlighted. The report that in early March 1766, the young women of Providence agreed not to use tea or buy any British manufactures until the law was repealed. Both tactics would eventually be key elements of American resistance, involving non-consumption by women and families, not just the non-importation by merchants that dominated the tactics in 1765, 1766. Non-consumption explicitly required action by many individual women, whereas non-importation focused on persuading or coercing merchants, only a few of whom were women. So it's a real difference between whether you're trying to persuade everybody not to buy stuff or whether you're just trying to persuade a few merchants not to sell stuff. And I think that the historical literature has not recognized the importance of this, of the distinction. And even more significantly, the Providence Daughters of Women, quote, unanimously resolved that the Stamp Act was unconstitutional, end quote. That was a bold and unprecedented collective political statement by American women, the earliest one I've located. It signaled the possibility of changes ahead in women's understanding of their roles in the public realm. There's nothing in these statements about we shouldn't really be saying this, or this is not our sphere, or this is not what we should be doing. They go ahead and do it. Yet the women soon ran afoul of a long-standing tradition in American print culture. Newspapers often critiqued and parodied Anglo-American women, especially if they ventured into the public realm. One of the first essays to caricature the activists published in Boston in early 1766 was signed Tabitha Strawbonnet. The author, surely a man, employed over-the-top language to exaggerate the effects of a proposed ban on imported mourning apparel that was included in the non-importation agreements. And among the things that were supposed to be not imported was mourning apparel from England. So Tabitha, identifying herself as a servant to a wealthy man, insisted that, quote, "This single step, if well followed, will have a greater effect on the prosperity of this country than 100 Prussian regiments," end quote. So clearly, the over-the-top language was satirical and was understood as satirical by everyone. Now, reports of women's political activities and such satires both disappeared from the press for many months between the late spring of 1766 and the fall of 1767. But then the news arrived that Parliament had adopted the Townshend duties, laying new taxes on certain imports, such as glass, paper, and tea. That information reignited colonial opposition, and the emphasis on economic tactics resumed. In late October 1767, the Boston Town Meeting formally resolved to encourage the use of colonial manufactures and to boycott a long list of boycotted items. On November 2nd, when the Boston Gazette reported the resolution, it also carried accounts of female Bostonians who were organizing to support resistance to the new taxes. One group, for example, promised to stop using imported ribbons in their millinery and their clothing. And ribbons, of course, came from England. They were very difficult to make. You couldn't really do a homespun ribbon. So this was something that the women would give up, they said. And another said they would forego tea in their diet. The latter group remarked pointedly that tea should have been included in the Boston men's list of items that should not be purchased. So the Boston men in the Boston Town Meeting they listed a whole lot of things. It's like almost a full page in the Boston Gazette of all the things that the Bostons say they're not going to buy. And it doesn't include, tea is not one of them. So the women say, yes, we're not supposed to buy tea. We shouldn't buy tea either. So they want to add tea to that list. Now, publicly expressed skepticism of the aims and impact of women's actions reemerged simultaneously on the very same day. One Henry Flint published an address, quote, to the ladies of North America in the Boston Gazette, advising women to adopt, quote, a plain homespun garb. Now, perhaps there was nothing objectionable in that, since other people were saying the same thing, but he also compared women who would follow his prescription to the heroines of the Old Testament. Like Tabitha's exaggeration, the phrasing revealed his satirical insincerity, and people recognized that. A few weeks later, a young American, quote unquote, who was identified as a Harvard student by one of the readers of the Boston Gazette, decried, quote, luxury and extravagance in dress for both sexes, but directed his calls for, quote, frugality, economy, and industry primarily to women. He admonished them to avoid such frivolous subjects as, quote, dress, scandal, and detraction while they engaged in, quote, noble pursuits, presumably including spinning. So in other words, the women were gossiping and doing stuff while they were spinning, so they shouldn't do that. Notice he said nothing about men's conversations. He only talked about women's conversations. A third man, Mr. Squibo, weighed in shortly thereafter, praising the spinners for their determination not to drink tea. That sounds good. But then he revealed his true point by stressing that instead they were insisting that everyone could drink only an American-made item, that is, rum. So they weren't too happy about that either. Now, Mr. Squibo's calumny led 3 Boston women, signing themselves Aspasia, Belinda, and Corinna, to respond to all 3 men at the same time. They began with a complaint that Mr. Squibo had, quote, scandalously insulted them. Quote, the ladies of America have been diverse times addressed as persons of consequence in the present economical regulations, they asserted. His charge that female Bostonians drank rum was abusive. As for the young American, they deemed his characterization of their conversation to be, quote, a base aspersion, but they generously said they would forgive him because he was obviously young. And they informed Henry Flint that they would wear their old clothes. I particularly like this one. They informed Henry Flint that they would wear their old clothes until they could no longer be repaired, and only then would they replace them with homespun, because that would be preferable to setting aside perfectly good clothing that they could still wear. Declaring themselves, quote, willing to be ridiculed by the little wits and foplings of the present day, they concluded, this is another phrase I really like, quote, inferior in abusive sarcasm, in personal invective, in low wit we glory to be, but inferior in veracity, honesty, sincerity, industry, love of virtue, of liberty, and of our country, we would not willingly be to any, end quote. They were obviously truly annoyed by what the men had been writing. Now, people here who are familiar with Liberty's Daughters or who paid attention to the epigraph that was used in the publicity for this lecture will recognize at least some of the passages I have just quoted from this crucial letter by these 3 Boston women who are anonymous. I have no idea who they were. There's no indication anywhere of them. Their names never appear again in the Boston papers. 40-odd years ago, I understood implicitly the significance of the women's pride at being, quote, addressed as persons of consequence in the present economical regulations. I accordingly highlighted that pride in my discussion in the book. But what I did not then understand was the importance of other statements in the letter that I failed to quote. As I reread the letter in preparation for the talk this evening, 2 additional passages jumped out at me, and I want to underscore their significance now. First, the 3 women explicitly lauded, quote, the well-judged measures adopted by the Boston Town Meeting. Like the Providence Spinners, who voted that the Stamp Act was unconstitutional excuse me, 2 years before, these women therefore formally took a political stance, publicly aligning themselves with popular assemblies composed of men and boldly asserting themselves into men's so-called sphere without apology. Second, even so, the admonitions of Joseph Addison, I quoted at the beginning of this talk, clearly continue to resonate with them. They insisted that female Bostonians, quote, were detached from every party or parties of politicians, end quote. I'll repeat that. They were detached from every party or parties of politicians. They thus stressed that they were not Addison's female politicians filled with party rage and presumably would not lose their beauty after a year. Instead, the respectable women they spoke for, quote, loved and supported the public good and were willing to sacrifice for public virtue. Further, they indicated that if their letter was greeted with insolence by critics, they would not deign to respond, but instead would, quote, show ourselves to be above them when they affect to treat our sex as inferior. And as I said, I don't know who these women were. I sure wish I did. But they predicted that the future would demonstrate the depths of women's commitments to the cause of resistance, but that didn't happen, not immediately. From late 1767 through 1769, newspapers throughout the colonies, not simply in Massachusetts, focused on examples of women wearing homespun and drinking tea drinking tea substitutes on social occasions. It was reported in Providence, for example, that, quote, a number of ladies visited a friend, quote, dressed principally in the manufactures of this country and without ribbons again. Their hostess, too, wore the same garb, serving them refreshments that did not include tea. A New York paper touched all the bases in advising women poetically. Quote, "Where none but your own country linen of economy boast, let your pride be the most to show claws of your own make and spinning." It repeated the request that, quote, "to agree that you'll not married be," here we are, still got that, "to men who will wear London manufactory, and urge them to, quote, throw aside your bohea and your green hyson tea and all things with a new fashion duty." The poem concluded by assuring young women that, quote, "though the times remain darkish, young men may be sparkish, and you may love much stronger than ever." In other words, it doesn't matter if you're wearing homespun, men will still want to marry you. So personalizing rather than politicizing the advice to women. Even with the wide publicity given to such incidents and such advice, inverse or not, women's behavior seemingly reverted to the localized private actions they originally adopted in the wake of the Stamp Act. All the while, men, again, this is the reaction to the Townshend Acts in the late 1760s, men were engaged far more publicly in opposition to the Townshend duties and engaging in riots and public rituals chronicled in the press at great detail and dubbed by Gary Nash, of course, a well-known historian here in Philadelphia, as street theater. And there's very little evidence of women ever engaging in street theater. There's one incident in New York that would qualify, and if people want to ask me about it later, I can talk about it. Some of that public behavior in Boston involved holding celebratory bibulous dinners convened by the Sons of Liberty. For example, the Sons in August 1768 attracted a large, varied crowd of people together to watch them sing and drink under the Liberty Tree to mark the 3rd anniversary of a major demonstration against the Stamp Act. I mean, I try to call to mind what this would be like. The members of the Sons of Liberty are singing and drinking under the Liberty Tree, and everybody's standing around and watching them, and that seems to be the event. I don't quite get it, but anyway, people seem to enjoy watching the Sons of Liberty drink and sing. And on that occasion, the fair daughters of liberty, you will not be surprised to learn they did what? They made a brilliant appearance in the windows watching what was going on down below. They were in nearby houses, and they showed their approval with, quote, smiles of satisfaction as the men offered toasts. After the group reconvened elsewhere for dinner, the men continued toasting, and again, the papers record all the toasts. The 19th of 45 recorded toasts praised, quote, North America and her fair daughters of liberty, end quote. That's the first time I've found them mentioned in any of the toasts at any of these rituals that were written up in the papers. Now, at the identical celebration a year later, which also began at the Liberty Tree in front of a reputed 300 spectators, but then moved for dinner to the appropriately named Liberty Tree Tavern in Dorchester, the same toast, quote, to North America and her fair daughters of liberty, moved up from 19th place to 2nd, became the second toast of 45 ritual toasts. And if anybody wants to know why there were always 45 toasts, I'll talk about that later too. It's a minor point, but an interesting one. There's always 45 toasts at any of these events. So what had happened in the interim to change the priority that the Sons of Liberty accorded to the daughters at their commemoration? Although it's impossibly certain, the answer likely lies in the renewed public and well-publicized activities of female patriots, in particular, the revival of spinning bees and the attention paid to them by the press. Had many such events been held quietly without publicity in the interim? There's no way to know. But in 1769, accounts appeared in multiple New England newspapers profusely praising the participants in more than 30 spinning meetings, as Laurel Ulrich and I both discovered. And Peter Oliver, the Massachusetts loyalist, who later wrote a history of what he called the American Rebellion, certainly thought the spinners were important. He accused them of helping, quote, the Black Regiment. That's what he termed the Congregationalist ministers in New England who supported the revolution. He accused the spinners of helping the Black Regiment create, quote, a new species of enthusiasm for resistance to Britain. The public reports had standard elements. The young ladies, quote unquote, always young ladies, that's always the phrase. The young ladies gathered in the home of a prominent local man, often but not always the minister, and often outside, especially if the group was sizable, for the spinners reputedly ranged in number from fewer than 10 to more than 50 on some occasions. They brought their own wheels and they supplied their own flax and wool. They spun much of the day engaging in appropriate conversation and being fed appropriate food and drink, not tea, of course, by their host or by onlookers. At the end of the day, they possibly listened to a sermon, especially if the host was the local clergyman. What happened to their output differed. Sometimes its fate was not specified. Other times it was said to be donated to the minister and his family or to the local poor. Usually the published accounts totaled the number of skeins of wool or flax produced and stressed the high quality of the work. Now, since spinning well requires practice, I should say, I have tried to spin, it is not easy. Since spinning well requires practice, I've never taken the time to practice, so I never do it very well. And the spinners, if they truly were young ladies, quote unquote, could well have been very inexperienced. Such assurances were crucial, the assurances about the quality of the output. But how accurate were those statements that it was really excellent quality yarn? One account that I found in a newspaper said that an older woman took 3 weeks to learn how to spin, and she was working pretty constantly during those 3 weeks to teach herself how to spin. Another stressed that a group in Newport, quote, agreed to have no trial who should spin most, but to spin good, fine yarn, end quote, instead, thus suggesting that quality and quantity could frequently be at odds. And so it's just not clear if there was a lot of yarn being spun, was it really any good? We just don't know. Now, my former student Kate Hallman, in her book, The Politics of Fashion in 18th Century America, has pointed out that the spinning bees were both performances of, quote, refined and virtuous femininity and new and legitimate social opportunities for young women, something that I didn't understand in the 70s. An account from Rhode Island made that motivation explicit. The writer noted that 11 Newport, quote, daughters of liberty delighted in each other's company and had agreed to visit their houses in turn and to convert each visit into a spinning match. Such participants not only competed with each other to produce high-quality skeins of yarn, but also were moved, as the newspapers reported, quote, by the many late examples of others, or were, quote, zealous of emulating, yea, ambitious of excelling their sisters in other towns. Thus, the widespread publicity for the gatherings appeared to encourage even more of them. Some of the published accounts both lauded women and took the opportunity to criticize men for failing to follow their example. An author from Huntington, Long Island, for example, praised 16 young local women who had held a spinning match, then added, quote, would the gentlemen but endeavor to imitate them, there would be many happy effects. Rouse then, ye idle drones, he exclaimed, ye tavern haunters, and distinguish yourselves by some act of industry, or expect no more favor will ever be given you by the ladies. So again, we have a personal argument. If you don't get out and do something for the revolution or for resistance at this point, the ladies will not pay you any attention. In what is today the best-known poem of the 1760s, the Pennsylvania Quaker Hannah Griffiths detailed women's activism in verse and then concluded, quote, thus acting, we point out their duty to men, end quote. So that was the message. And when preaching to the 77 young women who had gathered at his house to spin in early June 1769, the Reverend John Cleveland of Ipswich, Massachusetts, compared women's and men's achievements, quote, the women might recover to their country the full and free enjoyment of all our rights, properties, and privileges. And then he added, which is more than the men have been able to do, end quote. So there was a lot of praise for these women's actions and criticism of men for not doing the same thing. Now, in focusing thus far, and indeed throughout this talk, on American women's opposition to British measures in the 1760s, I don't mean to imply that all colonial white women were involved in the resistance movement. I have, after all, written extensively about loyalists, and indeed female loyalists were the subject of my very first essay on women's history in the 70s, before I wrote the book. In the context of economical regulations, as the three Boston women called them in 1767, it's important to realize that some, quote, she merchants ran afoul of the provisions of the non-importation agreements. It seems, at least in part, because they believed that the agreements did not apply to them in the same way they applied to men. And I found some evidence of this. I want to cite two examples. It would be instructive. If anybody here knows of any other examples, it would be really interesting to know. The first one is from Boston, and I do describe it in Liberty's Daughters, although, again, because of my ability to work with the newspapers now, I do have some more information about it. In late 1769, Anne and Elizabeth Cumming, sisters who ran a small dry goods shop, received an order of goods from London. Soon, committeemen came to the shop and charged the sisters with violating the non-importation agreement. Elizabeth responded that, quote, "We have never entered into any agreement not to import, for it was very trifling our business," end quote. She informed the committeemen that they had already sold some of the goods, quote, never expecting they would take notice or try to injure two industrious girls who were striving in an honest way to get their bread, end quote. The committee ordered their names published in the local newspapers as violators of the agreement, and indeed there's even some broadsides that were put out with their names on it. But instead of hurting them, the publicity apparently drove people to their doors because, hey, they had good stuff that nobody else in town had because they had not been following the non-importation agreement. Anne Cumming reported that they had more customers than ever. And one of those customers, a young woman accused of buying her wedding dress from them, this is from the newspaper, defended herself by claiming ignorance. She didn't know they were listed as not, there's something she shouldn't buy from. She also said, well, I didn't really buy my wedding dress from them. I bought just an ordinary satin gown. I didn't buy my wedding dress. So obviously that was not as much of a problem. So a key question this raises for me is, did people really shun those people named in the advertisements? Or did those ads, such as Anne Cumming suggested, direct local people to where they could buy desirable imports? They could buy stuff that they couldn't find anywhere else if they read these ads telling them not to patronize these particular shops. Also, of course, they said they didn't sign the non-importation agreement. So what about people who didn't sign? What about other people? And what about this issue of trifling business? That's another one. So my second example is more dramatic, and it's one that I didn't know anything about. As I said, this one I wrote about in Liberty's Daughters, the Cumming sisters, but the other one I didn't know anything about until I did this particular project. It comes from Charleston, South Carolina. When Anne Holmes married in 1745, she was described as, quote, a celebrated beauty with a good fortune. She and her husband, Benjamin Matthews, both came from very prominent local families in Charleston. In May 1768, the by then widowed she merchant Anne and her son Benjamin Jr. ordered 2,000 pounds worth of goods for him, since she hoped to use her London contacts to set him up in business prior to his marriage, which was planned. But after various complications, the cargo did not arrive until January 1770. And months earlier, in July 1769, Anne and her son had both signed the local non-importation agreement. So this is a different situation than the Cumming sisters, who did not sign non-importation. Anne Matthews and her son signed it. But note, they ordered goods in May 1768, They signed the agreement in July 1769, and because of the complications of receiving their items, they arrived in January 1770. Now, at the urging of the local committee, Benjamin Jr. agreed to store the newly imported goods until non-importation ended. But Anne vociferously objected to both her son and to the committee on the grounds that they should be allowed to sell the imports because their orders had so long preceded the agreement. They had ordered these goods long before the agreement had been issued, long before they had signed it, and so they should be able to sell these items. Deeming the committee's prohibition, quote, cruel and partial, she decided on her own to sell a few of the items. In late May 1770, the Charleston Committee then accused mother and son of violating the agreement and published their names as, quote, obstinate and inveterate enemies of their country. Now, what's really interesting about this incident is that 2 weeks later, she mounted a lengthy, vigorous defense in one of the 3 Charleston newspapers, explaining in detail what had caused the delayed arrival of the cargo. She then went further, too, accusing the committee of selective enforcement because, guess what? Citing examples of prominent men who'd been allowed to import items without penalty. So she said, there are all these guys who are breaking the non-importation agreement, and you're not doing anything to them, and you're trying to stop us. She also claimed, like the Cumming sisters, that her sales were hardly worth noticing and had only attracted attention because one of her neighbors was a committee member who feared her as a competitor and saw people coming to her house to buy this stuff. So she basically accused the committee of partiality and of favoring men over her and her son. The local response to this was extraordinary and negative. 2 days after her essay appeared in the newspaper, a person or persons, no idea who it might have been, created an effigy of her, which was placed in a pillory in a prominent location before dawn on the morning of June 17th, 1770. At mid-morning, a provincial official took possession of the effigy and handed it over to the custody of the town's watch. It was then held in the watch house during the day, but at nightfall it was removed by a mob, paraded around town, and publicly burned, the only known instance of an attack on a woman's effigy. The only one I know, certainly. I've never heard anything before of the effigy of a woman being burned in this way. There's no description of how many people were involved in the mob. There's no description of whether the mob was composed only of men. All we know is there was a mob that took the effigy from the watch house where it was being guarded, and they then paraded around town and burned it. The event seems to have shocked the town. The local newspaper, most closely aligned with the Sons of Liberty, remarked in its account of the affair that, quote, moderate, and that's italicized, moderate people appeared in general, very much concerned at the exhibition on account of some particular circumstances, and I think it's because it's an effigy of a woman. This is unique, and they understand it's unique. I think that's why, and also a prominent, wealthy woman, because of some particular circumstances, and would have prevented it if possible, but the majority not admitting the reasons to be sufficient to justify or palliate any deviation whatsoever from the resolutions, it appears there is no safety in breaking them. In other words, everybody has to obey the resolutions because there's no way not to, because the mob will control the situation. Now, in the aftermath of this incident, the leaders of the watch lost their job because they had not protected the effigy. They had been ordered to keep it in the watch house, and then later, when the mob grabbed it, they'd been ordered to retrieve it, and they did not do either one. So there was a heads will roll, so heads rolled in the Charleston watch as a result of this. Now, what followed then appears to have been a negotiated settlement of sorts. An ad for the goods appeared in one of the local papers on September 24th, 1770. So all of that had occurred in June. These goods had not been advertised. This new stuff had not been advertised. So finally it's advertised in September of 1770. A few days later, Benjamin Matthews publicly and abjectly apologized for the sale of goods from the cargo and turned the rest over to the committee to be stored until non-importation ended. He promised to observe non-importation strictly and without any evasion from that point forward. His mother was not mentioned, nor was she identified as his partner when he again posted ads in 1771. After that, they both possibly left town, although probably not the colony. I just don't know what happened to them. But the genealogy websites claim that they died and were buried in Charleston, so they seem to have been still around, but who knows? So is it possible to speculate on the basis of these cases from Boston and Charleston that female merchants with relatively small retail businesses believed that the non-importation agreement applied primarily to larger male importers rather than to themselves, and that they could well feel aggrieved and discriminated against by committeemen's actions, which they saw as preferring prominent men, which I think occurred in both Boston and Charleston. So the expansive colonial boycotts of British goods that tripped up both the Cummings sisters and Ann Matthews in late 1769 and early 1770 were soon replaced by a more targeted campaign. After news arrived in spring 1770 that Parliament had repealed the Townshend duties, except for the tax on tea, the emphasis on merchant boycotts, home manufacturing, and spinning bees disappeared from the American press as imports largely resumed despite the continuation of a nominal boycott. Taking a newly prominent place in reports of resistance schemes were accounts of women, singly or in groups, pledging not to drink imported tea. Such pledges were in one sense nothing new, because remember, they only dated back to the women of Boston, who in 1767 had pointed out that the men's resolution had not included ending tea purchases. But a significant formal statement came from female Bostonians who, perhaps newly empowered by the praise for the home manufacturers campaign, collectively and definitively abandoned Addison's strictures on women's political behavior. In a statement appearing more than once in the press, and I might say that this is a statement that's been known. A lot of people have published it, but I think, again, if you understand the context, you understand how important it is. A group described as upwards of 300 mistresses of families, described as, quote, ladies of the highest rank and influence, asserted that they had to defend, quote, our invaluable rights and privileges, which were being attacked in an unconstitutional and most alarming manner. Accordingly, they explicitly aligned themselves with men who had met at Faneuil Hall and vowed to abstain from drinking tea. The women, of course, added something else. They added sickness accepted. If we're sick, we'll drink tea, but otherwise we won't. Now, 2 weeks later, 226 young ladies, quote unquote, identifying themselves as the daughters of the original signers, added their pledges to those of their mothers, indicating that 110 more mistresses of families had now signed the original statement. Peter Oliver mocked all these people, accusing them of having purchased large stocks of tea in advance before they made these public promises, and then of drinking their tea out of chocolate or coffee pots to hide what they were drinking. They were not, to hide that they were consuming this forbidden beverage. So again, there was a lot of satire and laughter about what the women were doing. But the tea boycott continued during the next several years with sporadic attempts at enforcement and encouragement to avoid tea drinking appearing in the press, both under male and female pseudonyms. It gained new momentum after Parliament passed the Tea Act in 1773 to try to save the East India Company from financial distress. Again, as with the ads naming tea importers, one must wonder if the exhortation to boycott tea reflected the success or the failure of the anti-tea campaign. And James Fichter of the University of Hong Kong has a forthcoming book in this coming fall that talks about this at great detail. He's done an amazing amount of research on the tea trade in the colonies. The campaign involved anti-tea poetry. For example, an oft-reprinted poem titled "A Lady's Adieu to Her Tea Table." It involved some clever and not so clever satires, and it involved attacks on tea as bad for women's health, which I was particularly, as a tea drinker, particularly involved in, particularly like those. And I discussed this campaign in my book, 1774, so you can read the details there. I'm not going to talk about it today. In the early 1770s, some contributors to newspapers began to envision American women as participants in the political community, a position clearly earned by their involvement in resistance activities. And I want to conclude by talking about these particular essays. One of the first such publications appeared in March 1771 when a group of, quote, true daughters of liberty, end quote, publicly petitioned the Boston town meeting to move an oration commemorating the Boston Massacre of March 5th, 1770, from Faneuil Hall to a larger venue so they could attend along with the men. It's the only such petition I know about. They insisted that the hall was simply too small, at Faneuil Hall, was simply too small to accommodate everybody, and so that oration by James Lovell was indeed moved to the Old South Church, which was much larger, and we can only assume that the women were among the attendees. The persistent indications of women's political activities were scattered but telling. Women in Virginia and New England signed non-consumption agreements. Women in North Carolina convened and formally voted to support resistance, an event famously satirized by a British cartoonist as the Edenton Ladies' Tea Party. I'm sure you've seen that cartoon. It was not about tea. Their statement said nothing about tea, zero. It was about, what they did was they supported congressional action, and thus were therefore making a more radical statement of their own political sentiments than it would have been if they'd been talking about boycotting tea. Supplementing the stories of women's direct political activities, newspapers occasionally exhorted them to greater efforts. In early 1771, a New York author directed women to, quote, know your own importance. No longer focus only on your own families, he said. Quote, consider yourselves as entitled to a suffrage and possessed of influence in the administration of the great family of the public. Take a part in the momentous affairs of the community, he admonished female readers. Such a call for women's civic engagement stood out as a significant break from the Addisonian tradition. I mean, he's saying, women, take a role, take an important public role, and that's in early 1773 in New York. So too did the language of an essay that appeared 2 years later in the Newport Mercury, addressed to, quote, the female inhabitants of the colony of Rhode Island. The author, signing himself, quote, a friend to liberty and the fair, initially struck a traditional note with the comment, quote, neither politics nor arms seem to fall to your province. But then he asserted that he knew women whose political judgments compared to those of sensible men. That's his phrase. He continued, quote, you have as much business to converse on that subject as they have, end quote. Completely different from what was being said in the 1750s and 1760s. What a change from what I was quoting earlier. Only Tories who insisted affect to wonder what business women have with politics and tried to silence women. He concluded by encouraging women to, quote, employ your tongues as well as your fingers in the glorious cause of liberty. In short, spinning wheels were no longer enough. That essay was published about a month before the Revolutionary War began at Lexington and Concord, And one might think, looking ahead, that it presaged a new political role for women. To some extent, yes, it did, but as we all know, and as I argued in Liberty's Daughters, although many aspects of white women's lives changed during and after the war, involvement in politics was not one of them. And we know from Rosie Zachary's book that was Revolutionary Backlash that she published in 2007, we know what happened next. So I point out that book to your attention. So why did the tentative trends that I have traced here this evening remain stillborn? In short, I think, men's tactics in opposition to Britain changed. They changed course in the year 1774, a process I detailed in my most recent book. From stressing strategies that included women's efforts, like home manufactures of cloth and large-scale consumer boycotts that required enlisting women as well as men, colonial leaders pivoted to more traditional electoral politics in the wake of the First Continental Congress and the adoption of the Continental Association. They moved away from attempting to organize the people at large, including women, to relying instead on ad hoc local political authorities to take control through an already identified voting population of white male freeholders. Yeah. So did they do that deliberately to exclude newly politically empowered women from a chance of sustained participation in politics? I'll ask that question again. Did men do that deliberately to exclude newly politically empowered women, as I've shown tonight, from any participation in formal politics? As I wrote about this process in 1774, sometimes I thought it was deliberate. At other times, I was not so sure. So I leave it to all of you as an open question, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Probably ready for his chair by now, huh?
Yeah. I'm going to leave this here and I'll pick it up later.
Sure thing.
Yeah.
I think it's on.
Is this on? No. Yes. Is that on?
Yeah.
You're good.
Yes?
Yes.
Okay.
So I know we only have a few minutes for questions because we want to make sure that we have an opportunity for book signing, but I want to start with our in-person audience if we have a question. Meg?
Over here.
Dr. Norton, a personal note, if I may. You and I met 55 years ago this fall when you were assigned as my senior thesis advisor at Harvard. And it was a very fortunate meeting for both of us. For you, because as you told me, I was the only one of your four advisees.
I can hardly hear you, I'm sorry.
I
can hardly hear you.
Oh, I said you and I met 55 years ago.
Okay,
When you were assigned as my thesis advisor.
that I got, yeah.
And it was
What was the topic of your thesis?
Sorry?
What was the topic of your thesis?
New England Merchants Club.
Okay.
Society for Encouraging Trade and Commerce in the Province of Massachusetts Bay. In any event, it was a fortunate meeting for you because, as you told me, I was the only one of your advisees who wanted to study a topic before 1960. And as you put it, that's not history, that's current events. But it was even more fortunate for me because you taught me so much. You're one of the best teachers I ever had. It was a great privilege to work with you under Professor Balin. Harvard is sometimes criticized for handing over the teaching of undergraduates to graduate students, and it sometimes doesn't work.
Yeah, I was a graduate student. What the hell did I know?
Well, more than I knew. Well, you taught me the best lesson I ever knew about writing, which is just because you wrote it, don't fall in love with it. And I've tried to follow that principle throughout. So I greatly enjoyed the experience, and I'm very grateful. So thank you.
Wow, thank you so much.
Do we have a Zoom question in the back there?
Question from Zoom. With this remarkable insight, it brings a new context to Abigail Adams' quote to her husband, "Remember the ladies." Because John was so deep into Congress, did he miss the sea change in Boston and the surrounding locales, or was he committed to the Addisonian thinking?
I heard more of a statement than a question there. And of course, I did stop this talk with the 1774. I didn't really continue. I mean, everything does change afterwards, so.
All right, I always get the last word here. Oh, there's a question.
Not so fast. Remember the ladies.
I feel seen.
So also on a personal note, I cited a lot of your works when I was doing both my undergraduate thesis and my graduate thesis. So thank you very much on women's garment labor. So on that question, for example, there's a letter from Sally Franklin Bache to her father, Benjamin Franklin, where she says, "Can you get me some fabrics and ribbons from France because everything is super expensive here?" So then Benjamin Franklin responds with, "You should be doing your political patriotic duty by spinning this yourself." And she said, "That's great, but I have stuff I spun 3 years ago that I can't weave yet because I'm so busy being a mom and a wife and representing the Franklin family because you're not here and mom's dead." So in the research that you've done, where women have posted in the newspaper about the realities of their labor in regards to garment construction, whether that's, spinning wool to be woven or knit, has there been this kind of discussion of like, this actually takes a very long time? And doing the best thing, the most ethical clothes you have are the ones that are currently in your closet rather than wasting fabric to make homespun.
Yeah, I mean, things that were discussed in the newspapers were the collective public things. They weren't the individual actions, except for those women I loved who said they wouldn't marry men who obeyed the law, or they wouldn't marry with legal marriage licenses under the Stamp Act. But there's only certain types of things that appear in the newspapers, and it's not as though the newspapers are complete records of everything that was happening. That's really obvious. But because the newspaper editors included things that were in accordance with them. I should say, when I talked, the Charleston case is so interesting because there are 3 newspapers. There was the one that was aligned with the Sons of Liberty. There was another one that was sort of iffy. And then there was a conservative newspaper. And it was the conservative newspaper that Ann Matthews wrote her statement in. And the statement of the newspaper that was aligned with the Sons of Liberty clearly was very unhappy about what had happened, and was stating that, and was let me put it this way, it's very hard to figure out what was going on because everybody is really quiet about it. There's hardly any information from Charleston at that time because a lot of the revolutionary records of South Carolina were destroyed in the Civil War. I wish I knew more, but there's only certain things that get into the newspapers and other things don't, even though they're important things. So what can we say?
That is a perfect segue
Yeah.
to the question I'm dying to ask you. Which is, what's happening with the world of your scholarship and artificial intelligence?
Yeah. Well, just for kicks, a few weeks ago, I decided to see what ChatGTP would say about the subject of women and the coming of the revolution. So I posed that question, and I got a very interesting answer. Part of it was just sort of normal, not very interesting record of something. But then there were two intriguing parts to it. One was that the artificial intelligence identified Esther DeBert Reed, who of course people in Philadelphia know was an important patriot, as a loyalist. It said she was a loyalist. She was of course British, but she wasn't a loyalist. And even more interestingly, it made up a completely fake pamphlet by a woman. It said there was a woman named Anna Campbell who had written a pamphlet called A Series of Letters. And it was completely made up. I mean, it was a complete fake. So that was my experience with ChatGPT. I do not recommend it for this period.
So there's still some work to be done by human historians, is that what you're saying?
Absolutely, right.
Well, join me in celebrating one of our favorite human historians, Mary Beth Norton.
All right, let me just get my stuff out of
Sure
here.
thing.
Yeah. Scott, Eric, but that guy in the back, I didn't catch his name, did you? Get his name, the one from
Howard
Harvard?
Mitchell.
Oh, Howard.
Yes,
Oh, geez.
yes, Howard.
Yes,
He'll come up.
I remember his name.
Yeah, good
Now that you mention it.
friend of the museums.
Oh, that is so funny.
Yeah.
That is so
I've
funny.
known Howard for about 30 years, so.
That is so funny.
Here, let me take that, so you got the free use of your. There we go.